Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the massive, fascinating machinery of India's democratic process. Going through the source material, it is literally mind-blowing to see the stark contrast between the idealistic blueprint of the Constitution and the messy, chaotic reality on the ground. We have a lot of incredibly detailed legal ground to cover, so let's jump right in.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with recognizing political parties, then look at systemic crises in politics, check out the Election Commission and electoral reforms, and finally, wrap up with grassroots democratic decentralization. All right, let's get into part one, recognizing political parties, or as I like to call it, the ghost in the machine. To understand this democratic engine, we have to start with its primary fuel, political parties. But here's a totally wild fact for you. The framers of the Constitution didn't even mention them. Seriously, there was a massive regulatory vacuum. Unlike the constitutions of Germany or South Africa, India's original text had zero explicit framework for political parties. They were basically operating as ghosts in the machine, just floating around under the general fundamental right to freedom of association. Because of this silence, later lawmakers had to frantically build the entire legal framework completely from scratch.
So how did they fix that vacuum? Well, it was a bit of a legal scramble, to be honest. To stop total political chaos, the Representation of the People Act in 1951 brought in Section 29A. Suddenly, any group calling itself a political party had to formally register with the Election Commission within 30 days and officially swear allegiance to constitutional principles. Then, the 1968 Election Symbols Order stepped in, giving the EC the crucial power to hand out and reserve those famous electoral symbols based on how a party actually performed at the polls.
But get this, the ultimate constitutional recognition didn't actually happen until 1985 with the 52nd Amendment. This added the 10th schedule to the Constitution, and it was essentially a desperate patch on a very leaky engine. The whole point was to tackle the rampant issue of political defection. By legally recognizing parties, this amendment finally allowed for the outright disqualification of lawmakers who defied their party mandates or just, switched sides after winning. It forced a baseline of internal discipline to stop that crazy party-hopping phenomenon.
Moving on to part two, systemic crises in politics, or what happens when there's engine failure.
So bringing parties into the legal fold was a step forward, but it definitely didn't cure the underlying rot. Today, these parties are dealing with some massive interlocking crises, which brings us to a really uncomfortable question. Who is actually funding our democracy? Historically, political funding has been a complete black box. We're talking undisclosed cash donations and shady shell companies that have made corruption practically endemic to the system.
This opaque financing really hit a boiling point with the electoral bond scheme introduced in 2018, which basically legalized anonymous corporate funding. But then came 2024. In a super dramatic landmark ruling, the Association for Democratic Reforms case, the Supreme Court unanimously struck the whole thing down. The court laid down a massive constitutional principle here. Unlimited, anonymous corporate funding directly violates a voter's fundamental right to information under Article 1911A. I mean, it makes sense, right? Knowing exactly who pays the bills is absolutely crucial to having a free and fair election.
And the problems go way beyond just financing. There is also the deeply entrenched issue of the criminalization of politics. Way back, the Vora Committee laid bare this heavily documented systematic nexus between political parties and actual criminal syndicates. And the crazy part? Even though the Supreme Court stepped in heavily in 2002 and again in 2020, forcing parties to publicly explain why they're fielding candidates with pending criminal cases, the proportion of lawmakers with criminal records just keeps going up. It's a complete failure of self-regulation.
To make matters worse, there's a glaring lack of inter-party democracy. Instead of holding open, fair internal elections, a lot of these parties operate like autocracies, totally driven by dynastic control or central high commands behind closed doors. And right now, the Election Commission doesn't even have the statutory power to deregister a party just for being undemocratic internally. Because of this, scholars argue that India desperately needs a comprehensive Political Parties Act to enforce some accountability and finally tear down those closed doors.
All right, that brings us to part three, the ECI and electoral reforms, aka the mechanic.
With the engine sputtering like this, we need to bring in the constitutional mechanic, the Election Commission of India, or the ECI. Sourced directly from Article 324 of the Constitution, the ECI was built to be a completely independent, permanent body. Interestingly, over time, it actually evolved from a single member setup into a multi-member commission, just to guarantee absolute impartiality.
and they have enormous power, sweeping constitutional authority to oversee literally every single aspect of the electoral process for both parliament and state legislatures.
That constitutional mandate rests on three massive pillars: superintendence, direction, and control. This gives them the teeth to enforce the model code of conduct and make sure everyone is playing on a level field. The sheer gravity of this role was locked in by the Supreme Court in the famous Raj Narayan versus Indira Gandhi case. The court basically said that free and fair elections aren't just a best practice, they are an unalterable part of the Constitution's basic structure. Simply put, without them, you literally do not have an Indian democracy. Because they're right at the center of all this, the ECI is constantly caught up in massive reform debates. A huge one right now is the One Nation, One Election proposal, backed by the Coven Committee. On one side, proponents say, hey, synchronizing Lok Sabha and state assembly elections will save a ton of state money and stop governance from grinding to a halt every few months. But on the flip side, the critics have some deep structural fears. They argue it threatens federalism, completely drowns out regional issues, and would require some incredibly complex and maybe even dangerous constitutional amendments.
Aside from those big structural debates, the ECI has really leaned into technological fixes. The rollout of electronic voting machines, or EVMs, was an absolute game changer. It practically wiped out historical, violent malpractices like physical booth capturing, but, modern tech brings modern skepticism. So to build trust, they integrated VVPATs, voter verifiable paper audit trails. This debate over trust went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2024. While the court gave a hard no to regressing back to paper ballots, they did mandate significantly enhanced VVPAT verification to make sure the machinery remains 100% transparent to the voter.
Let's move to our final section. Part 4. Grassroots Democratic Decentralization. Power to the Parts.
Finally, let's zoom all the way out from New Delhi and look at India's massive, ambitious project of democratic decentralization. Spurred on by early groups like the Balant Rai Matta Committee, the 73rd and 74th Amendments of 1992 were an absolute watershed moment. The whole thing was fundamentally rooted in Gandhian philosophy, this core idea that true democratic development can't just be dictated from the top down. It absolutely has to start with planning and self-governance right at the grassroots level.
These amendments pulled off a complete structural revamp across the country. By granting explicit constitutional status to panchayati-raj institutions and urban local bodies, India wasn't just tweaking local administration. They literally established a formal third tier of governance. This legally ensured that the actual power of self-governance is held by the people closest to the issues.
This system locked in a really clear three-tier structure. You've got the Gram Panchayat at the village level, the Janpath Panchayat at the block level, and the Zilha Parishad at the district level. But this was way more than just administrative shuffling. Crucially, it empowered the Gram Sabhas, which are assemblies made up of all the registered voters in a village, giving them the power to actually conduct social audits and directly steer their own local development planning. Now, arguably the most radical part of these amendments was a massive constitutional guarantee. A minimum 33% reservation for women across all these local bodies, running right alongside strict demographic quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Talk about a game changer. In a single stroke, it massively expanded inclusive political participation, bringing millions of marginalized voices directly to the decision-making table in a way that national politics honestly still struggles to match.
However, just like with the national parties, we have to soberly assess the reality versus the blueprint. While inclusion definitely skyrocketed, there is still some serious structural rust. Local bodies frequently deal with elite capture, getting hijacked by dominant caste groups or wealthy local contractors. We also see the pervasive Pradhan Pati syndrome. That's where elected female representatives are tragically sidelined, acting as mere proxies for their dominant male relatives. And maybe most critically, true financial autonomy is still kind of a mirage. State finance commissions are routinely delayed or just straight up ignored, leaving these local bodies starved of their own revenues and heavily dependent on tightly controlled conditional grants from the state.
So, from the total constitutional silence around political parties to the Supreme Court striking down electoral bonds, and from the sweeping powers of the Election Commission to the localized everyday struggles of the panchayat system, this democratic machinery is vast, it's imperfect, and it is constantly evolving. Looking at the deep systemic flaws we've unpacked in this explainer and the ongoing push for reforms, I want to leave you with this. What structural evolutions are truly required next to genuinely secure the future of the world's largest democracy? Keep asking the big questions. Thanks for joining me.